The morning Eva Winslow buried her husband, not a single soul in Harlan County believed she would last the winter alone. It was the autumn of 1874, deep in the red dust country of West Texas, where the wind came off the caprock like a judgment, and the sun baked the earth until it cracked like the spine of an old Bible. The town of Millhaven sat at the edge of a dry creek bed that flooded twice a year and smelled of juniper and horse sweat on the best days. It was not a beautiful town, but it was a living one, full of people who believed they knew the business of other people better than those people knew it themselves. Eva was 27 years old the day they put Thomas Winslow in the ground. She stood at the grave in a black dress that had once belonged to her mother, and she held the hands of her two children, Clara, who was 6, and James, who was 4, and she did not weep in front of the assembled crowd. That was the first thing they said about her. They said it with soft voices and sad eyes and the kind of pity that wraps itself around a woman's throat like a gentle hand that squeezes just enough to remind her it is there. "Poor Eva," said Mabel Crocker, the postmaster's wife, to her neighbor Agnes Tillies on the walk back from the cemetery. "She has got nothing now. Thomas left debts, they say. The farm is practically rubble, those 2 little ones and no man to help her. Poor Eva." "She was always too proud," Agnes said back, which was the other thing people said about her, as though pride and sorrow could not live in the same body, as though a woman who held her chin up at a graveside had something wrong with her. Eva heard none of this. She was already walking back to the farmhouse, one small hand in each of hers, and she was thinking about the water pump that had been broken for 3 weeks and the corn that had not been harvested because Thomas had taken sick in September, and the fence along the eastern pasture that had needed mending since spring. She was not thinking about pity. She was thinking about what needed to be done next. Thomas Winslow had not been a cruel man. He had been a weak one in the way that some men are weak, not through malice but through a kind of slow surrender to circumstance. He had borrowed money from the Harlan County Bank, a loan held by one Clement Greer, who was both the bank president and a man of flexible ethics, and he had meant to pay it back with the harvest. But the harvest had been poor, and then his lungs had gone bad, and then September had become October, and October had become a pine box in the red dirt. He left behind 40 acres of half-worked land, a broken water pump, a 2-room farmhouse with a roof that leaked in 3 places, 2 children, a mule named Patience, and a debt of $230 that Clement Greer had been very patient about mentioning at the funeral reception while Eva was still cutting bread. "I don't wish to cause distress," Greer had said, with his soft banker's voice and his soft banker's hands, "but the bank has obligations of its own, Mrs. Winslow. We will need to speak about the note before the end of the month." "We will speak about it," Eva had said, and had handed him a slice of bread, and had moved on to the next guest without another word on the subject. That was the second thing they talked about. Her composure, her refusal to crumble. It made people uncomfortable in the way that a strong woman can make an entire community uncomfortable, as though her steadiness called into question the ease with which they themselves might fall apart. The end of October came. Eva had harvested what was left of the corn by herself, getting up before the sun and working until her hands bled, with Clara and James helping in the small ways that children can help, carrying water, pulling dried stalks away from the rows, sitting in the shade of the wagon and singing to themselves when they got too tired. She sold the corn at Tillman's dry goods store for less than it was worth because Jeb Tillman knew she needed the cash, and he was not a generous man, though he always sat in the front pew at Sunday services. She got enough to buy flour and salt pork and lamp oil for 2 months, and she put the rest aside in a tin box under the floorboard near the hearth. She went to see Clement Greer at the bank on a Tuesday morning in late October, with Clara and James left in the care of old Mrs. Purdy next door, who took them in with a sorrowful look that Eva had already learned to ignore. The bank was on Main Street, which was really just the single paved stretch of Millhaven, bracketed by the dry goods store on one end and the saloon called the Red Ace on the other, with a telegraph office, a barber, a livery, and a church in between. Greer sat behind his desk like a man who had grown into the shape of his chair, round and settled and sure of himself. He had a neat mustache and neat ledger books and a way of folding his hands on the desk that made everything seem like a foregone conclusion. "The note is for $230, he said. "I have been more than patient, Mrs. Winslow, given the circumstances, but the bank cannot extend indefinitely." "I understand that," Eva said. "I have $60 in cash. I can give you that now as a payment against the principal, and I can have another 60 by spring if the winter wheat takes." Greer looked at her for a long moment, and in that look was a calculation she recognized from the faces of men who had been looking at her since Thomas died, who were looking at her land and her situation and deciding what it was worth to them. "The land is worth something," he said carefully. "If you were to sell, you could settle the debt entirely and have a little left over, enough to get yourself and the children settled somewhere more manageable. There is a family in Amarillo who—" "I am not selling," Eva said. "Mrs. Winslow, I am not selling the land, Mr. Greer. My husband is buried on that land. My children were born on that land. I am offering you $60 now and 60 more in spring. If that is not satisfactory, we can let Judge Haverly hear what the note says about terms and whether a bank can call in the full amount before the agreed year is out." Greer's neat mustache twitched. He did not like the mention of Judge Haverly, who was elderly and unpredictable and had a habit of ruling in the favor of widows, possibly because his own mother had been one. "I will accept the $60, Greer said stiffly, as a gesture of good faith. Eva counted out the bills on his desk with steady hands, and she walked back out into the pale October sunlight, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to lean against the outside wall of the bank and close her eyes and breathe. 3 seconds. Then she straightened up and walked to Mrs. Purdy's house to collect her children. It was during those 3 seconds that Frederick Bailey first saw her. He was riding into Millhaven from the north, which was the direction of nowhere in particular in that part of Texas, a direction that a man took when he had been somewhere else and was not entirely sure where he was going next. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 4 or 5 days. He rode a gray horse named Soot, which was a foolish name for a gray horse, but the horse had been named as a foal when it was dark, and had simply kept the name the way people keep habits that no longer fit. He had a rifle in his saddle scabbard, and a bedroll behind the saddle, and a canvas pack that held everything else he owned, which was not a great quantity. Frederick Bailey had been a cattle drover, and before that a ranch hand, and before that a boy who had grown up in Missouri and come west at 17, because the West was where a young man went when the East had nothing left to offer him. He had no family left to speak of. He had a reputation, in the way that quiet men who do their work well have reputations, as someone steady and capable and not easily rattled. He had also, in the years of trail work and ranch work, developed the specific skill of looking at a piece of land or a situation, and seeing what it was rather than what it appeared to be. He saw Eva Winslow for 3 seconds, standing with her eyes closed against the wall of a bank, her black dress pressed flat by the wind, her hands at her sides and perfectly still. He saw a woman who was not defeated. He saw a woman who was gathering herself the way you gather yourself before you lift something very heavy, not because the weight has broken you, but because you are thinking about leverage and angle and how to do the job clean. He did not stop. He rode on down Main Street toward the livery and thought about whether Millhaven was the kind of town where a man might find a few weeks of work. As it turned out, it was. The man who owned the livery was named Hatch, a barrel-shaped man with a gray beard and a distrust of strangers that was balanced by a distrust of having too much work and not enough hands. Frederick tied up Soot and asked after work, and Hatch looked him up and down with the specific squint of a man who has been cheated by drifters before, and said that he might have something if the stranger did not mind hard work and could be trusted around horses. "I have been around horses most of my life," Frederick said. "I can see that by how you tied the animal," Hatch said, which was as close to a compliment as he got in the first few weeks. $50 a week plus board in the loft. $2 a week, Frederick said. $75, Hatch said. Done. He was settled in the livery loft by nightfall. He ate at a small cafe run by a widow named Mrs. Garza who made pinto beans and corn bread and did not talk excessively, which Frederick appreciated. He learned in the way that you learn things in a small town simply by being present and keeping your ears open, about the basic geography of Millhaven and its people within 3 days. He learned about Eva Winslow on the 4th day, from Hatch, who mentioned her while they were raking out stalls. "Widow woman took her mule in to Tillman's for a new shoe last week," Hatch said, not to Frederick specifically but in the way that people in liveries talk, generally outward. "Thomas Winslow's widow. You see her around, tall woman, dark-haired, got 2 small ones trailing after her. She's trying to work that farm alone, 40 acres. That is a lot of land for one person," Frederick said. "It is a lot of land for 10 people with that soil," Hatch said. "Hard clay, most of it. Thomas never did get it drained right. She planted winter wheat, they say. Everyone figures she won't last through spring." He shook his head with the comfortable sadness of a man who is not the one in the situation. "Poor woman, whole county feels for her." Frederick said nothing. He thought about the woman he had seen for 3 seconds outside the bank, and he thought about the word poor in relation to her, and the word did not fit the way he had seen her stand. He did not seek her out. He was not the kind of man who sought people out. But Millhaven was a small town, and the world has a way of arranging itself. He saw her 2 days later at Tillman's Dry Goods. She was buying lamp oil and a paper of needles and a length of muslin, and she had the 2 children with her, Clara solemn and watchful beside her, James at her knee looking at a jar of hard candies on the counter with the focused longing of a 4-year-old. Eva was talking to Jeb Tillman about the price of flour in a quiet, firm way that made clear she knew the price had gone up since last month, and she wanted to know why. "Shipping costs," Tillman said with the ease of a man who did not feel he needed to justify himself. "The Calhoun Ranch buys 20 pounds at a stretch, and I am told they pay what I paid in September," Eva said. "I am not asking for credit or favors, Mr. Tillman. I am asking for the same price as anyone else." Tillman looked at her. Then he wrote the September price in his ledger with the resigned expression of a man who has been out-argued by someone he underestimated. Frederick was standing near the back of the store with a coil of rope, and he watched all of this and said nothing. He paid for his rope and walked out. But on the way out, young James Winslow, still watching the candy jar, stepped sideways directly into Frederick's path, and Frederick stopped short to avoid knocking the child down. James looked up at him from approximately knee-height with the unconcerned assessment of a small child. "You are very tall," James said. "I have been told that," Frederick said. "My mama is tall too," James said. "She is the tallest lady." "James," Eva said from the counter, turning, and her eyes met Frederick's across the store. It was the first time he had seen her face directly and not in profile, and it was a face that matched the posture he had noticed outside the bank, clear-eyed and composed, with something underneath that was not fragility but its opposite, a kind of tensile strength that had been pressed into shape by circumstance the way steel is pressed. "I beg your pardon," she said. "He wanders." "No harm done," Frederick said. He looked at the boy, then back at her. "Ma'am." He nodded and walked out, and Eva watched him go for a moment before turning back to Tillman to complete her purchase. She did not ask who he was. She had enough to think about. But she noticed. Women in difficult circumstances notice things that other people miss, because their attention to the world has been sharpened by necessity. She noticed that he had stepped around James with care instead of impatience. She noticed the rope he had been buying, and the fact that he had clearly been examining it for quality rather than grabbing whatever was closest. She noticed that he had not looked at her with pity. He had looked at her the way you look at someone you have not yet decided what to think about. That was unusual enough to note. November came hard that year. There was an early frost that took out some of the newly planted wheat and left the ground iron-hard for 2 weeks. Eva worked through it the way she worked through everything, methodically and without complaining to anyone, though she allowed herself, on one particularly bad night when the roof was leaking over the children's bed, and she had run out of rags to catch the drips, to sit down on the floor of the kitchen and press her forehead against the cool surface of the wooden table and let herself feel, for exactly 10 minutes, the full weight of how tired she was. 10 minutes. Then she got up, found the cast iron pot and positioned it under the worst drip, and went back to bed. Word had gotten around that the Winslow farm was struggling. This was not news. What made it interesting, in the way that difficult news becomes interesting in a small town, was the specific flavor of struggle. Clement Greer had not been subtle about the existence of the bank note. Some people felt genuinely sorry for Eva. Others felt what passed for sorry, but was really a mild satisfaction at the confirmation of what they had always believed, which was that a woman could not run a farm alone, particularly one with Thomas Winslow's history of mismanagement behind it. The result of this general awareness was that several men had made their way out to the Winslow farm in October and November, with offers of varying degrees of helpfulness. There was Bill Rooney, who was a neighbor and a widower himself, and who offered to buy the eastern 10 acres at a price so low it was nearly an insult. There was Pete Carver from the saloon, who offered a loan at terms so unfavorable they amounted to a slow taking of everything she had. There was even, memorably, a Sunday visit from Reverend Marsh, who suggested with great pastoral gentleness that Eva consider whether the farm was truly the right path, and whether she had considered moving in with her sister in San Antonio. Eva did not have a sister in San Antonio. She had a distant cousin in Lubbock she had not spoken to in 4 years. She declined all of these offers with a directness that continued to make people uncomfortable, and that they continued to describe as pride, as if the word were an accusation. Frederick heard pieces of these visits through the general circulation of information in Millhaven. He did not offer advice about what he heard. But in early November, riding out past the Winslow farm on a Sunday afternoon on his way to check on a fence Hatch had asked him to look at on the property edge, he saw something that stopped him. The water pump in the yard was still broken. He could see Eva working around it, carrying water from the creek in buckets, a distance of about 100 yards from the house. She had rigged a yoke across her shoulders to carry 2 buckets at once, which was efficient and clever. But the ground between the creek and the house was soft after a recent rain, and she was sliding and correcting her footing with every step, the bucket swaying, her jaw set with concentration. He watched for a moment, then dismounted, tied soot to the fence post, and walked over. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, from enough distance that she would hear him before he was close, because walking up behind a woman working alone was not a thing he would do. She turned and looked at him. She remembered him from Tillman's. He could see that. "The pump," he said. "What is wrong with it?" She was quiet for a moment, not suspicious exactly, but measuring. "The piston rod is cracked. The leather seal is also gone. I wrote to the hardware man in Abilene 2 weeks ago about the part." "May I look at it?" She set her buckets down and led him to the pump without comment. He crouched beside it and worked the handle and listened to the sounds it made, and then looked at the rod and the housing. "I can fix this," he said. "The part is not here yet," she said. "The rod can be splinted with a length of iron bar and wound tight with wire. It is not a permanent fix, but it will hold until the proper part comes. The seal I can cut from harness leather." He looked up at her. "I worked on irrigation equipment one summer in Kansas. I know this kind of pump." She was looking at him with those clear, direct eyes. "I did not ask for your help," she said. "It was not unfriendly, it was honest." "No," he said, "I am offering it. You can say no. Something moved across her face, not softening exactly, but a kind of reassessment. "What do you want for it?" "Nothing." She looked at him for another moment. "That is not how things usually work," she said. "I know," he said, "but that is what I am offering." There was a pause in which the wind moved through the dry grass of the yard, and Soot shifted his weight at the fence post, and somewhere one of the children called out something from inside the house. "All right," Eva said. He went back to the livery for the iron bar and wire and borrowed a piece of harness leather from Hatch, who asked where he was going, and then nodded when Frederick said the Winslow farm, with the expression of a man who has decided not to make a comment about something. He was back within the hour. He worked on the pump for an hour and a half, lying on his side in the dirt with his tools, cutting and bending and fitting. Eva did not hover. She went back to her work, and he could hear her inside the house and outside in the yard, the sound of her moving through the day's tasks with steady purposefulness. Clara came out once and stood at a polite distance, watching him work with the focused observation of a 6-year-old who is cataloging information. "What is your name?" Clara asked. "Frederick," he said from under the pump housing. "I am Clara Winslow," Clara said. "Are you fixing our pump?" "I am trying to." "Good," Clara said, with the blunt satisfaction of a child who regards outcomes practically. "Mama has been carrying the buckets and it is very far." He tested the handle when he was done. The pump drew water on the third stroke, a thin thread that became a solid stream as the pressure built. He stood up and pumped it 3 more times to be sure, and the water came clean and steady. Eva came out of the house with James on her hip, drawn by the sound. She watched the water run from the pump spout and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "It works." "It should hold a month or 2, he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "When the proper rod comes in, have Hatch look at it or write to me." "Write to you where?" she said. "I am at Hatch's livery," he said, "for now." She looked at him again with that measuring look. "Thank you," she said. Not the way people say it automatically, reflexively, but the way it is said when it is meant. He nodded, collected his tools, untied Soot, and rode on toward the fence he had been originally sent to look at. He was aware, riding away, of a feeling that was difficult to name precisely, but had something to do with the specific satisfaction of a thing done right and given freely, without any expectation attached. He thought about her the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening. He thought about the pump and the buckets, and the yoke she had rigged for her shoulders. He thought about the way she had said thank you, and the way she had first said, "I did not ask for your help," and the way both of those things together made a kind of sense that was rare and interesting. He went to Sunday service the following week, which he did not always do, and he sat in the third pew from the back and saw Eva sitting with her children 6 rows ahead, her dark hair neatly pinned under a hat that had been through better seasons, her back straight in a way that was not stiffness, but the spine of someone who has decided not to apologize for taking up space. Afterward, in the yard of the church where people gathered as they do after services in small towns, Mabel Crocker attached herself to Eva's side and spoke to her in that particular pitch of voice that carries concern and carries it loudly enough for the surrounding people to hear. "We are all just so worried about you, Eva dear," Mabel said, and her hand was on Eva's arm in the way that grips disguised as comfort. "Winter coming and everything you are carrying. I said to Harold just last night, that poor woman—" "I am fine, Mabel," Eva said pleasantly. "But the farm and the children and the debt—" "I am fine," Eva said again in the same tone, and Frederick, standing 12 feet away talking to no one in particular and watching everything, heard the precise texture of that repeated fine, which was not a dismissal but a boundary. A line drawn clearly, without malice, that said, "I know what you are doing and I am choosing not to participate in it." He smiled slightly, looking down at his hat brim, and then looked up to find that Eva, over Mabel Crocker's shoulder, was looking directly at him with an expression that was very nearly amused. He held her gaze for a moment. She looked away first, but the corner of her mouth had shifted. That was the beginning. He found reasons to be useful that were not pretexts but genuine needs. He was at Hatch's livery when Patience the mule came in with a loose shoe and a peculiar gait, and he helped Hatch look at the animal and found a stone bruise under the frog of the left forefoot, a thing that needed poulticing and rest, and that Eva, who had been planning to use Patience to drag fence posts the following week, needed to know about. He rode out to tell her. She was at the fence herself, which he should have expected, using a hand post-hole digger on the iron-hard November ground with methodical, relentless effort. "Patience has a stone bruise," he said. She straightened up and pushed hair off her forehead with the back of her wrist. She was flushed from the work and the cold, and there was a smear of clay along her jaw, and the sight of her working like this, with this total absence of performance, struck him somewhere central. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough to rest her 2 weeks. Not bad enough to be permanent if she is rested." He dismounted and looked at the half-dug post hole. "May I?" She considered him. "You keep turning up," she said. "I have noticed that," he said. "Why?" It was a direct question from a direct woman, and it deserved a direct answer. He thought for a moment about what the honest answer was. "Because you are doing everything correctly, and the world is making it harder than it needs to be," he said. "And I am not busy on Sunday afternoons." She watched him. "That is a careful answer. It is an honest one." She handed him the post-hole digger without another word. He worked on the holes for 2 hours while she cut and strung wire, and they worked alongside each other with the easy quiet of people who do not need to fill silence to feel it is comfortable. Clara and James moved in and out of the yard, James at one point falling asleep in a pile of dry grass near the fence with his coat pulled up to his chin, which Eva pretended not to find charming and absolutely did. When the fence section was done, and the light was getting thin and gold in the way of late afternoon in November, Eva heated coffee on the kitchen stove and put 2 cups on the kitchen table, and they sat across from each other in the small warm kitchen with the smell of wood smoke and coffee around them. And they talked. Not about pity or difficulty, or the bank note, or any of the things that everyone else talked about when they talked about Eva Winslow. They talked about land and soil, and the specific challenges of farming in West Texas clay. They talked about cattle, and Frederick told her about the drives he had been on, up through the Panhandle and north through Kansas, and she listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood what he was describing. She told him about coming to Millhaven from East Texas at 19, following Thomas, who had plans and enthusiasm and a cousin's land promised to him that had not materialized, so they had built the farmhouse themselves and started from a much worse position than anyone knew. He was not a bad man, she said. He meant well. He was just not well suited to disappointment. It was the most she would say about Thomas, and Frederick understood it was all she was going to say. He did not push. "The winter wheat," he said. "How much of it came through the frost?" "About 2/3, she said. "Enough if winter is not too hard. It usually is in these parts." "I know." She looked at her coffee cup. "I have mulched what I can. I have been reading about it." Mrs. Garza at the cafe had a farming almanac from 1871 that had a section on cold weather grain. Frederick thought about Mrs. Garza, who was a practical, no-nonsense woman, and about the fact that Eva had been quietly finding information wherever she could find it. He thought about all the people who were busy pitying her without offering her any of that. "You have been doing everything right," he said. "The mulching, the fence repair to keep livestock off the wheat rows, the water management, all of it." She looked at him. "How do you know what I have been doing?" "I have ridden past a few times," he said. He said it without apology or evasiveness, but he felt the slight vulnerability of the admission. She did not seem alarmed. She seemed to be thinking about what it meant. "You have been watching to see if I am managing," she said. "I have been watching to see what you need," he said. "Those are different things." She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he could hear James coughing softly from the other room where the children had been put to bed, and Eva's attention moved toward that sound and then back, a mother's constant peripheral listening. "He coughs in the cold," she said. "It is nothing serious. He has done it since he was 2. "There is a woman in town," Frederick said, A Mexican woman, Senora Delgado, who lives on the south end. She knows herb medicine. Has a preparation she makes for coughs, from dried sage and something else she would not tell me the name of. I have seen it work." Eva looked at him with an expression that combined surprise and something more complicated. "You know her? I brought her firewood last month. She is elderly and alone, and her supply had run out." He picked up his coffee cup. "She might give you some of the preparation for James if you asked, or traded something. She likes preserves." There was a silence in which something shifted between them, not dramatically but the way the air shifts before rain, a change in pressure and direction. "You do this a lot," Eva said slowly. "You see what people need and then you quietly arrange for it to be addressed." "Not usually," he said. "Mostly I mind my own business. But not here." "No," he said, and he held her gaze and let the word be what it was, an acknowledgement without a full explanation. Because the full explanation was that he had been watching this woman manage an impossible situation with more intelligence and grit than anyone around her seemed to notice. And something in him had simply refused to let that be invisible. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked out the window at the darkening yard and said, "I do not need anyone to save me, Mr. Bailey." "I know that," he said. "I am not trying to." "Then what are you trying to do?" He thought about it. "Help from beside you," he said. "Not in front of you. There is a difference." She turned back to him, and her expression was different now, not guarded in the same way. Something had been resolved in her face, some question answered to her own satisfaction. "Yes," she said, "there is." He rode back to the livery in the dark with his breath showing in the cold air, and he thought about the warmth of the small kitchen and the directness of her eyes, and the way she had eventually laughed at something he said about a disastrous river crossing in Kansas. A full laugh, not polished or restrained, just a real sound of real amusement that made him want very much to say something else funny so he could hear it again. He did not sleep easily that night. He was not a man given to sleeplessness, but he lay on the loft cot with the horses shifting below him, and thought about a woman who had held herself together by the force of her own intelligence and stubbornness, while the whole of Harlan County treated her as a project in charitable concern. And he thought about how none of them had thought to sit down with her in a warm kitchen and just talk to her as a person who knew things and thought things and had a full interior life that had nothing to do with being a widow with a debt and 2 children. He thought about the line of her jaw and the way she pushed her hair back with the back of her wrist when she was working. December came. He continued to find reasons to be at the Winslow farm on Sundays, and occasionally on a weekday afternoon when Hatch did not need him. He fixed the leaking roof, which required 2 days of work and several bundles of shingles that he bought with his own money, and did not mention having paid for until she asked directly, at which point he told her she could repay him from the wheat profit in spring, and she said she would, and they both knew this was a kind of compromise that preserved the transaction between them as something neither charitable nor indebted. He liked her children. James had attached himself to Frederick with the complete and unself-conscious trust of a small child who has decided someone is trustworthy, and would tell him at length about whatever was of interest that week, a series of topics that ranged from a bird he had seen that had a red chest to a detailed account of what patience the mule had been eating. Clara was quieter and more watchful, like her mother, and she regarded Frederick with careful assessment that he respected. He answered her questions seriously, which was all she needed to give him the approximate status of a trusted person. Eva watched all of this. She did not comment on it, but he could feel her watching, not suspiciously but attentively, the way a careful person attends to important information. There was an afternoon in mid-December when they were both working on the drainage ditch along the south edge of the wheat field, because the freeze-thaw cycle was throwing up ice and water in a way that needed management, and they were working parallel to each other with shovels, and it was cold enough that their breath made small clouds, and Eva said without preamble or particular context, "Why have you stayed in Millhaven?" He kept working for a moment. It has good reasons to stay, he said. She glanced at him sideways. You came through on your way somewhere. I thought I did, he said. She was quiet, working. Then, where were you going? I did not have a particular destination. I was between things. He drove the shovel into the mud. I stopped here. Because of the livery work. That is part of it. She stopped working and leaned on her shovel and looked at him with the particular directness that still had the power to make him feel seen in an unfamiliar way, as though her gaze went past the usual surfaces. Mr. Bailey, she said, I am a woman with 2 children and a debt and 40 acres of difficult land. I want to be clear-eyed about my situation, and I want you to be clear-eyed about it too. I am, he said. I am not looking for someone to manage things for me, she said, and I am not looking for a caretaker for my children. They are my children and my responsibility and my joy. I am telling you this because I think you are a person who deserves honesty. I appreciate that, he said, and I am not looking for either of those things. What are you looking for? She said. He was quiet for a moment because the answer deserved to be right. A person worth knowing, he said. A life that has some meaning to it, work that matters, those things. He met her eyes. I think I have found the first one. The cold air moved between them with the whisper of dry grass. Eva looked at him for a long moment, and the expression on her face was doing several things at once that Frederick was learning to read, the precision and the guarding, and underneath both of those things, something that moved. I think perhaps you have, she said quietly, and she went back to digging. Christmas came to Millhaven the way it always did, with a church service and an attempt at community warmth that was partly genuine and partly performance, the same as every year. Eva was there with Clara and James, who had been given peppermint sticks by old Senora Delgado, who had indeed given Eva the cough preparation, and taken a jar of persimmon preserves in return, and declared Eva a sensible woman, which was the highest compliment in Senora Delgado's vocabulary. Frederick was also at the service, which by now was not remarkable because it was known in Millhaven that he came every Sunday and sat in the back, and had been spending his off days at the Winslow farm, a fact which was known about in the way that facts are known about in small towns, thoroughly and without privacy. Mabel Crocker had opinions about this. She shared them with Agnes Tillys in the carefully modulated tones of a woman who considers herself a custodian of community welfare. It does not look right, Mabel said. Her with 2 small children and a strange man coming and going. People talk. He has fixed her pump and her roof and half her fencing, Agnes said, who had a more pragmatic view of most things than Mabel. That is not the point, Mabel said. But it rather was the point, which Mabel's version of concern could not accommodate. After the Christmas service in the churchyard, with the bare cottonwood trees strung with paper stars that the Sunday school children had made, Eva found herself standing next to Frederick near the fence, while the children chased each other around the church building, and they watched the general congregation mill about with cups of cider, and it was one of those moments that is simultaneously entirely ordinary and entirely clear. Clara told me she wants a primer for Christmas, Frederick said, for reading. She is very determined about learning to read properly, Eva said. She has been working through the Bible, but she wants stories. I have a McGuffey reader in my pack, he said. From when I was a boy, if you think she would want it. Eva looked at him. She looked at him for what she would later think was the first time that she let herself look without the measuring and the carefulness. Just looked at the actual person standing there. A man who had appeared in her life without drama or announcement, and who had fitted himself into it without taking anything over, who saw the work she did, and helped with the part he could help with and left her the rest of it because he understood it was hers to do, who talked to her as though her mind was a thing worth engaging, and who had, over the weeks and months of this difficult season, become the part of each week she found herself thinking about between times. That would be a wonderful gift, she said. I will bring it tomorrow, he said. He did. He also brought a carved wooden horse for James, which he had made himself in the livery during the evenings, And this was the thing that undid something in Eva that had been held carefully in place for quite a long time. Not the gesture itself, but what it signified, which was that he had spent his private time making something for her son, without being asked, without expecting anything, simply because it was a thing he could do. She stood in the kitchen doorway holding the little carved horse in her hand, while James made immediate and joyful use of it on the kitchen floor, and she felt something that was not grief and not relief but a third thing, a kind of opening, the way a door opens in a wall you had stopped thinking of as a wall. "Frederick," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. He was crouching to watch James run the horse along the floor, and he looked up at her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it the way she had meant it at the pump, the real way, but with more weight behind it now, weight that had accumulated over 2 months of Sundays and shared work and cold coffee at kitchen tables. "You are welcome," he said, equally quietly. James ran the horse into Frederick's boot and declared it had fallen in a canyon, and Frederick sat on the floor of the kitchen and played horses with a 4-year-old for the next half hour, and Eva watched from the doorway and felt the door open a little further. January was brutal, as West Texas Januaries could be. A blue norther came down from the panhandle in the second week and drove the temperature down past anything practical, froze the top inch of soil, bent the winter wheat flat under the ice, turned every morning into a survival exercise. Eva got up before dawn every day and banked the fire and heated water and checked the wheat rows and wrapped the children in every layer she had and kept everything moving. Frederick came every day during the norther. Not on one pretext or another, but plainly, arriving in the gray pre-dawn cold with firewood he had cut and split himself at the livery, stacked it against the side of the house without comment, then helped with the morning chores. He did not ask permission and she did not require it. Something between them had moved past the requirement for pretexts, and both of them knew it. On the 4th day of the norther, the farmhouse water pipe froze. It was not a disaster because the pump, the repaired pump, still worked, but it was a trouble on top of other troubles, and Eva, wrapped in her coat with ice crystals in her hair from the walk to the pump, stood looking at the pipe with an expression that was not despair but something adjacent to it, the look of a person who is very tired and very cold and has been counting up small catastrophes all week. Frederick found her there. He looked at the pipe and looked at her. "We can thaw this," he said. "It will take some time." "Everything takes time," she said, and her voice was flat, not cold, just wrung. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Eva." She looked at him. He almost never said her given name, and the sound of it in his voice, which was quiet and steady and warm in the gray cold morning, did something particular to the quality of the moment. "This is very hard," he said, "and you have been carrying it very well. That is the truth of the matter. But it is still very hard." She looked at him for a long moment, the ice crystals glittering in her hair, her breath in small clouds between them, and something crossed her face that was very close to the surface. "Yes," she said, "it is." He stepped closer and put his gloved hand alongside her face for a moment, a brief contact, a warmth, not more than that, but she leaned into it for exactly 1 second before straightening and taking a breath. "Let us thaw the pipe," she said. "Yes," he said. They worked side by side in the cold all morning, and when the pipe was running again and the house was warm and the children had been fed and were asleep in the afternoon, Eva sat at the kitchen table with Frederick across from her, and something between them was different, had been different since that moment in the cold, a degree of closeness that had been acknowledged without being formally stated. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "About the spring," he said. "About the wheat and the debt and the drainage and the planting after that." He looked at his hands on the table. "I have been thinking that I would like to be here for all of it." She watched him. "Not to take anything from you," he said carefully. "Not to manage the farm or make the decisions. Those are yours. They always will be. But I have been thinking that I would like to be here the way," he paused, looking for the right form of words, "the way a partner would be. Someone who works alongside you because they want to be where you are." The kitchen was warm and the fire was low, and the only sound was the wind at the window and the distant sound of James murmuring in his sleep. Eva looked at him for a long time. "That is a very careful thing to say," she said. "I have been working on it," he admitted, and she almost smiled. "I am not an easy person," she said. "I have opinions and I make decisions and I do not change them because someone else thinks I should." "I know that," he said, "and the children come first, always." "I understand that," he said. "I would not want it any other way." She looked at the table, then she looked at him. "I have not let myself," she stopped. "Since Thomas died, I have not let myself think about much beyond the next month's requirements. It has been necessary." "I know," he said. "You have made it very difficult to do that," she said. "You have made it difficult to think only about the next month." He waited. "I think about you," she said plainly, in the direct way she said everything. "I think about you and I think it is." She paused again, and he watched the careful woman choosing carefully. "It is not inconvenient," she said at last. He smiled, and it was a full smile that changed the whole geography of his face, the kind of smile that comes from the inside. "That is the most carefully cautious way anyone has ever said something like that to me," he said. "I have told you I am not easy," she said, but the corner of her mouth was doing the thing it did. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked down at their hands and then looked up at him and did not move her hand away. "I will take not inconvenient," he said, "and I will wait patiently for whatever comes after it." She turned her hand so their fingers were interlaced. "You are a very patient man," she said. "I am learning to be," he said. The norther broke in the third week of January and the temperature climbed back toward something survivable. The winter wheat had come through, most of it bent and flattened but rooted and alive, which was more than the previous 2 seasons had managed. Eva walked the rows in the pale winter sunlight and examined each plant with the focused attention of a person who understands that everything she has depends on this green, and she felt a cautious optimism that she shared with no one except, that same evening over coffee, Frederick, who listened and asked the right questions, and said that based on what she described the yield could be good enough to cover the bank note and leave a small surplus. "You sound sure of that," she said. "I have been reading the almanac Mrs. Garza lent you," he said. "The one from '71. She stared at him. "You borrowed my almanac. You left it on the kitchen shelf. I read it between the time you went to check on the children and the time you came back. I should have asked. I apologize." He did not look particularly apologetic. "You read a farming almanac in my kitchen," she said. "I am interested in knowing what you are dealing with," he said. The almanac was relevant. She shook her head, but she was not displeased. She was something else, something she was getting more accustomed to feeling around him, which was a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. February brought something unexpected. Clement Greer came out to the farm. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in his good coat and his neat hat, driving a single-horse buggy, and he found Eva in the yard and Frederick, who happened to be there working on a section of collapsed fence, which was a coincidence of the most convenient kind. Greer looked at Frederick and then at Eva and then performed a brief recalculation. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, "I have come to discuss the note." "I am glad to hear it," she said. "Let us go inside." They went inside. Frederick stayed outside, though Eva did not ask him to and he did not offer. He worked on the fence and listened to the wind. 20 minutes later, Greer came back out. His expression was the expression of a man who has been out-negotiated more completely than he expected. He got into his buggy and drove away without speaking to Frederick. Eva came to the door. "He has given me until June," she said. "If I pay $200 by June, he will call the rest forgiven as goodwill." Frederick turned from the fence. "That is better than before." "He thought he was going to propose something else," she said. "He thought he was going to propose that the farm be transferred to the bank's ownership with a tenancy arrangement. He had a document prepared." She held up a folded paper. "But I had Judge Haverly's son write a letter for me in November about the original note terms." I showed Greer the letter. "When did you see Judge Haverly's son?" "In November," she said, "after the first visit to the bank. I rode to Abilene on a Saturday while Mrs. Purdy had the children. She looked at the paper in her hand. I have been preparing for this conversation for 3 months. He looked at her. He felt something that expanded in his chest, something between admiration and affection and something wider than both of those. You never mentioned any of this, he said. It was my business to handle, she said. It was, he agreed. You handled it. She looked at the paper and then at him. And for the first time something came through in her face that was not armor or composure or calculation, but pure, unguarded feeling, a kind of exhausted relief. And before he thought about it, he had crossed the yard and she had stepped off the porch and they were standing very close. And she put her forehead against his chest, and he put his arms around her carefully, and they stood like that in the February wind for a long, quiet moment. $200 by June, she said into his coat. The wheat will do it, he said. I know, she said. She stepped back after a moment and straightened her spine and was Eva Winslow again, organized and capable and direct, but her eyes were bright and she did not pretend they were not. I need to start the supper, she said. I will finish the fence, he said. That was all, but it was everything. March came with warmth and rain, and the wheat rose out of the bent and wintered pasture and grew upright and green. And Eva walked the rows every morning with a look on her face that Frederick had never seen before, which was the look of someone watching something they fought for become real. He was there most mornings and most evenings, and during the days he was at the livery doing honest work, and the rhythm of it had the quality of a life being built, though neither of them had said it in those exact terms yet. There was an evening in March when Clara, who had worked through the McGuffey reader Frederick had given her, and was well into a volume of collected stories that Frederick had ordered from a bookseller in Abilene on Clara's behalf, asked Frederick directly at the dinner table whether he was going to marry her mother. The table went briefly silent. James looked up from his beans. Eva set down her fork. Frederick looked at Clara with the seriousness she deserved. That is a very direct question, he said. Mama says directness is a virtue, Clara said. Your mama is right, he said. So are you, Clara said. He looked across the table at Eva, who was looking at him with an expression that was doing the thing she did when she was trying not to smile but was also genuinely waiting to hear what he would say. I would very much like to, he said, if your mother agreed, and if you and your brother agreed as well since this is your home. Clara thought about this with the gravity of a 6-year-old conducting a serious evaluation. I think that would be acceptable, she said. James, do you think so? James, who was 4 and had already decided that Frederick was essentially the best thing that had happened to his daily life, said yes with absolute conviction and then went back to his beans. Eva looked at Frederick across the table and her expression was full, in a way he had been watching build over months, full of a kind of warmth and certainty that was not rushed and not cautious but simply true. You should probably ask me properly, she said. I intend to, he said. He asked her properly the following Sunday, on the edge of the wheat field in the morning light, with the wheat green and moving around them, and the sky very wide and very blue in the way of West Texas skies in spring that make you feel the world is larger and clearer than you remembered. He did not have a ring, which he told her plainly, because he had spent his money on shingles and iron bars and a carved horse and a book from Abilene, and he did not regret any of it. I do not need a ring, she said. I will get you one, he said, eventually. I know you will, she said, and she looked at him with the full, clear look that she had been gradually giving him all winter, the look that had nothing held back, and she said, Yes, Frederick, I will marry you. He took her face in his hands and kissed her, there in the wheat field in the wide spring morning, and she put her hands on his wrists and kissed him back, and it was not a young and reckless kiss but a decided one, the kind shared between people who know what they are choosing and are choosing it fully. April brought the wheat to near full height, and the days were long and warm, and Eva and Frederick worked the farm together in the way he had described in January, side by side, each doing their part, each respecting the other's competence and judgment, occasionally disagreeing about approach and arguing it out over coffee, with the productive friction of two people who each have good reasons for their positions and know how to listen. They disagreed once about whether to sell a portion of the eastern 10 acres that was still underperforming, which was the same portion Bill Rooney had offered to buy. Eva wanted to hold it. Frederick thought selling it would clear the debt with more margin. She looked at him with a precise expression. "That land is mine," she said. "I am not selling it to Rooney, not for any price." "I am not saying sell it to Rooney," he said. "I am saying consider the option." "I have considered it," she said. "The answer is no." He looked at her for a moment and then said, "All right." "That is all right. It is your decision," he said. "I gave you my thinking, you gave me yours. You are probably right about Rooney." He drank his coffee. "We will make it work with the wheat." She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts challenge and appreciation. "Most men would push harder on a point like that," she said. "I am not most men," he said. "No," she said. "You are not." The wheat came in at harvest in June, earlier than expected and better than projected, the long winter's hardship having pressed the grain into a density that brought a price above average from the grain buyer in Abilene. Eva stood in the field as the last of it was cut, with the children beside her and Frederick behind her, and she counted the stalks and thought about December and January, and the frozen pipe and the bank visits and the pity, all that pity, and she felt something that was not triumph exactly but its calmer cousin, satisfaction of the most earned kind. She paid Clement Greer his $200 in the third week of June, in cash, in full, on the same desk where he had laid out the tenancy document in February. She placed the bills down bill by bill, and he counted them with his neat fingers and wrote her a receipt, and that was the end of the bank note. She walked out of the bank into the June sunshine and did not need to lean against the wall this time, though she thought about the first time she had, and about the man she had not yet known who had ridden past on a gray horse. They were married in July. It was not an elaborate wedding. Eva had never wanted an elaborate wedding, and Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with the genuine warmth of a man who, when he was not offering unsolicited advice about moving to San Antonio, was actually a decent and kind person. The church was small and warm, and the July sun came through the windows in long yellow bars, and Clara stood straight as a post beside her mother in a new blue dress that Mrs. Garza had helped make, and James stood beside Frederick holding his wooden horse because he had decided this was an important occasion that required it, and there was no argument on that point. Mabel Crocker was there, and Agnes Tillies and Hatch and Mrs. Garza and old Senora Delgado, who sat in the front row and nodded approvingly throughout the ceremony with the air of someone whose opinion has been verified. And there were others, neighbors and townspeople, some genuinely glad and some there out of the consuming need to witness whatever happened next, and it did not matter because Eva was not there for any of them. She was there for the man standing at the front of the church in a clean shirt and a coat he had borrowed from Hatch, who was broader than him in the chest, which made the coat interesting. And she was there for the vows, which she said clearly and steadily, and meant with the same completeness that she brought to everything she did. Frederick said his vows with the same quality of decision he brought to everything, quietly and entirely, and when he said them he looked at her without looking away, and what was in his eyes was not the pity that had surrounded her for 9 months but its total opposite, a regard that saw her fully and was glad of what it saw. They went home to the farmhouse. It was still a 2-room farmhouse with a roof that had been repaired, and a water pump that had been properly fixed when the part finally came, and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke and corn bread. It was not large or impressive or anything that anyone would have expected to be the scene of happiness, but it was. Frederick moved his small canvas pack of possessions into the farmhouse, and that was all it took to make it his home, and the simplicity of that, the complete and uncomplicated sincerity of a person whose home is wherever the person they love is, was something Eva held close in a private way that she would sometimes take out and look at in quiet moments for years afterward. The The summer after the wedding was the fullest Eva could remember. The farm had enough, which was all she had ever asked of it. Frederick's knowledge of cattle and grazing had opened up a possibility they had not pursued before, using the eastern acres for a small herd, not a large operation, but enough to create a second income stream that evened out the unpredictability of grain prices. He talked to her about it over several evenings, laying out the numbers and the risks honestly, and they decided together, and that deciding together, the two of them at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the papers spread out, and their two minds working the problem from complementary angles, was one of the things Eva loved most about the life they were building. She had not said the word love out loud yet. She had thought it. She had felt it, in the particular way she felt things, completely and with full understanding of what it meant. She was waiting for the right moment, not because she was holding it back, but because she wanted the moment to be true to what it was. It happened in August, late on a warm evening, with the children asleep and the farm quiet and the stars unbelievably thick over West Texas the way they were in August, when you could almost believe the sky was made of light with a little dark scattered through it rather than the other way around. They were sitting on the porch steps, Eva with her shoulder against Frederick's arm, and the night was warm and still and completely peaceful. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said everything, directly and without ornament, but with the full weight of the person saying it, so that the three words carried everything they were supposed to carry. He turned to look at her, and the look on his face was very simple, the look of someone who has been waiting for a thing and is now in the presence of it and is in no rush to do anything but be there. "I love you," he said back. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The stars were very bright. "The whole county thought I was going to collapse," she said after a while, not bitterly, just as a statement of fact. "I know," he said. "They were very thorough about pitying me." "They were," he said. "Did you pity me when you first saw me?" He thought about it honestly because she deserved the honest answer. "No," he said. "I saw someone who was already carrying it. I thought you were remarkable." She was quiet for a moment. "You were the only one," she said. "I was paying better attention," he said. She laughed softly, that real unguarded laugh he had been working for since December, and he felt the familiarity and the warmth of it the way you feel the warmth of a fire you have been tending for a long time. Autumn came around again, a year after Thomas's burial, and it was a different kind of autumn. The cattle Frederick had brought in were settled on the eastern acres and growing well. The wheat had been planted again, this time with better drainage and a more experienced hand. The farmhouse had a new window in the kitchen that Frederick had put in to let in the south light, and Mrs. Garza had given them a braided rug for the floor that made the kitchen look like something you could be proud of. Eva went to Sunday service in a dress that was not black, which was not a statement she made for anyone else but which felt like something important to herself, a marking of the passage of a year and what it had contained. Mabel Crocker stopped her after the service. "You are looking very well, Eva," Mabel said, with an expression that was caught between the previous version of her concern and something new that had not quite worked out what to do with a situation that had not gone the way expected. "I am well," Eva said. "Thank you, Mabel." "The farm seems to be doing well," Mabel said. "It is," Eva said. "I am glad," Mabel said, and there was, underneath the years of comfortable pitying, a flicker of something that might have been genuine. "I worried for you." "I know you did," Eva said. She looked at Mabel with neither coldness nor warmth but a kind of clear acknowledgement. "It was a hard year, but I was never as fragile as everyone thought." Mabel looked at her. "No," she said slowly. "I suppose you were not." Eva found Frederick after the service, and they walked home with Clara and James, through the dry grass and the autumn light that was coming in flat and golden from the west. And James walked on Frederick's shoulders, because that had become the post-church tradition. And Clara held Eva's hand and told her at length about a story she had read in the book from Abilene, a story about a woman who sailed across the ocean. And Eva listened and thought about how much more of the world was available to Clara than had been available to her own mother, if the world could be kept open for her. "Do you think a woman can sail a ship?" Clara asked. "I think a woman can do most things that a man can do," Eva said, "if she is taught how. Will you teach me things?" "Everything I know," Eva said. They went home and cooked supper together, all four of them in the kitchen, Frederick handling the skillet with the focused competence of a man who had learned that useful skills have no gender, James sitting on the counter in defiance of kitchen protocol and eating a cold biscuit, Clara reading at the table between tasks, Eva at the stove, and the smell of the food and the sound of the family and the warmth of the room were all so fully themselves, so completely present and real, that Eva stopped for a moment with her hand on the cast iron handle and let herself feel it without qualification. This was a life, a real one, built from the hard clay of everything that had tried to break her. October came and they had been married 3 months when Eva realized, quietly and with certainty, that she was expecting. She sat with this knowledge for a day before she told Frederick, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to know her own mind about it first, wanted to be sure of what she felt, which was, when she worked through it completely, a cautious and enormous joy. She told him in the kitchen, as she told him most things directly and clearly after the children were asleep, and it was just the two of them with the lamp and the coffee. "I am going to have a child," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then his expression did the thing it did when something reached him very deeply, which was that it became very still before it became very full. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I am happy about it." He came around the table and put his arms around her from behind and held her in the warm kitchen, and she put her hands over his and they were quiet for a moment with the enormous fact of it between them. "Boy or girl, I do not mind," he said. "I do not either," she said. The baby was born the following June, which was a summer of good wheat and steady cattle, and a happiness on the Winslow Bailey farm that people in Millhaven talked about differently than they had talked about Eva Winslow a year and a half before, because now there was not much to pity, and instead there was something harder to name, the specific phenomenon of a person who was expected to fail having instead built something strong and real, which produces in some people a recalibration and in others a kind of residual cognitive dissonance. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas Frederick Bailey, the first name for a man who had been imperfect but had been loved, the middle name for the man who had showed up in the November cold with tools and an honest offer, and the last name for the family they were. Young Thomas came into the world red-faced and determined, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's broad shoulders already suggested in the compact force of him, and he went straight to nursing with the single-minded purposefulness of a person who has arrived and is getting on with it, which made Eva laugh even through her exhaustion. Clara was 7 by then, and received the news of a new baby brother with thoughtful assessment. "That is 2 brothers," she said, then went back to her book. James, who was 5, was completely undone by the baby in the best possible way, and spent the first week of Thomas's life asking to hold him approximately every 15 minutes. Frederick held the baby on the porch on the second evening, in the long summer light, and stood there with this small new weight in his arms and looked out at the farm, the wheat field and the cattle on the eastern acres, and the repaired fence, and the sound of the water pump working steadily in the yard, and felt the weight of a life that had become, somehow, exactly what he had not known he was looking for when he rode into Millhaven from the north on an autumn morning in 1874. He had spent nearly 15 years drifting, doing good work in places that never quite became home, never quite held him, living in the comfortable impermanence of a man who did not know what he was waiting for. He had not been unhappy. He had been incomplete in a way he had not known how to name until he saw a woman with her eyes closed against a bank wall gathering herself to keep going. He thought he had been looking for a place to belong. He understood now that he had been looking for a person worth belonging to. Those were different things, and only one of them made you feel the way he felt standing on this porch with his son in the evening light. Eva came to the door behind him, moving slowly and with the careful dignity of a woman 3 days out of childbirth who refuses to be treated as though she is made of glass. "Come inside," she said. "The evening is cooling." "In a moment," he said. She came to stand beside him instead, because she was Eva and she did not wait for moments to pass. She entered them. She looked at the farm with the same look he was looking at it with, the look of two people who have worked something hard into something good. "Do you know what Mabel Crocker said to me at the dry goods store last week?" she said. "What?" "She said she always knew it would work out," Eva said. Frederick laughed, a full, quiet laugh. "Of course she did. People rewrite the things they said," Eva said. "I do not hold it against them. They thought what they thought. People fear for widows because the world is structured to make a widow's situation genuinely difficult. They were not wrong to worry. They were wrong about me specifically." "They were wrong about you entirely," he said. "They were," she agreed, without heat, just with the calm accuracy of a woman who has always known her own value and has spent a year and a half demonstrating it. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and between them was the baby and the farm and 2 children sleeping inside, and the evening sky going amber and rose, and all of it was theirs, not because it had been given to them, but because they had built it with their own hands and their own stubbornness, and a partnership that was, by any measure, real. "I love you," she said, the same way she always said it, directly and completely. "I love you," he said, and kissed her temple, and young Thomas Bailey made a small determined sound between them that suggested he had opinions about the evening air, and Eva laughed and took him from Frederick's arms and carried him inside, and Frederick followed, and the door closed on the amber evening. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because life in West Texas in the 1870s and into the 1880s was never without difficulty, and they would not have respected a life that was. There were dry summers and hard winters. There was a year when the cattle had a sickness that took 3 of the herd before it was contained, and that year was lean, and required the careful management Eva was so good at. There was a question of schooling for Clara that resulted in Frederick riding to Abilene to speak with the school board there, which he did with the quiet, immovable persistence of a man whose stepdaughter was going to be educated, whether or not the system was designed to make it easy. Clara went to school in Abilene for 2 years, boarding with Mrs. Garza's cousin, and came home at 15 with the bearing of a young woman who has been given good tools and knows how to use them. James grew up with the land the way a child grows up when a farm is his from the beginning, knowing the soil and the seasons and the specific personalities of cattle with the intimate knowledge of someone for whom this is not work but nature. He had Frederick's patience and Eva's directness, a combination that made him formidably capable at 14. Thomas grew up last, and grew up with 3 parents in the functional sense, because Clara and James had both taken their brother's education seriously, and the result was a boy who could read at 4 and argue persuasively at 6, and who had his mother's eyes and his father's steadiness, and was, by general consensus, an extremely agreeable person to have in a room. Clement Greer retired from the bank in 1879, and his replacement was a younger man of somewhat better ethics who looked at the Bailey farm ledger, which Eva kept meticulously, and offered them a construction loan at reasonable terms so they could build the 2 additional rooms the farm needed. The farmhouse grew from 2 rooms to 4, and the kitchen was properly expanded, and there was a porch along the south side that caught the afternoon light in a way that Eva, who had once sat in a 2-room house in the dark counting the cost of lamp oil, could have dreamed about but had not allowed herself to at the time. She allowed herself to now. She sat on that porch on summer evenings with the children in and out and Frederick beside her, and the farm spread out below them in the low yellow light, and she did not count debts or losses. She counted what was there, which was, by any measure, more than enough. Millhaven grew slowly, as small West Texas towns did, and changed slowly, and the people in it changed along with it. Mabel Crocker eventually stopped seeing Eva as a project and began seeing her as a neighbor, which was a better kind of relationship for both of them. Agnes Tilley's daughter became Clara's particular friend when Clara came back from Abilene, which created a bridge between the two families that turned out to be comfortable for everyone. Old Senora Delgado died in 1880 at a very advanced age and left Eva her cast iron pot and her herb garden, which Eva maintained with the same serious attention she brought to everything. Hatch retired the livery to a younger man in 1882, and Frederick, who had long since stopped working there but had maintained the friendship, sat with him on the retirement evening, and they drank whiskey carefully and talked about horses and the 15 or so years since Frederick had ridden into town on a gray horse named Soot, who had also long since retired to the gentle life of a farm horse who did light work and ate well. "You turned out all right," Hatch said, which was the highest possible praise in his vocabulary. "I had good reasons to," Frederick said. He thought about Eva. He thought about the way she had said, "I did not ask for your help," and the way she had said, "all right anyway," and the way she had said yes in the wheat field in the spring light. He thought about every morning since then, the specific arrangement of a life that fits because the people in it have been honest with each other, have worked alongside rather than over each other, have chosen each other not because they needed to be saved, but because they wanted to be together. He rode home in the evening dark on the horse that had replaced Soot, a younger bay that James had named Sergeant, because James had gone through a brief period of naming everything after military figures, and he rode up to the farmhouse with its 4 rooms and its south porch and its lamplit windows and the sound of voices inside. Eva was at the kitchen table with Thomas, helping him with his letters, and she looked up when Frederick came in, and the look she gave him was the look that had been developing for years now, accumulated warmth, the kind that builds in a face when a person is genuinely glad to see someone every single time. "How was Hatch?" she said. "Retired," Frederick said. He hung his coat and sat down at the table. He said, "I turned out all right." "He is understating things," Eva said. "He always does." Thomas looked up from his letters. "Papa, is Hatch the man with the gray beard?" "He is," Frederick said. "He gave me a penny once for sweeping outside his livery." "That is very generous for Hatch," Frederick said. Eva looked at him over Thomas's head, and her eyes were warm and amused and completely full, the way they always were now, this clear-eyed woman who had chosen a full life deliberately and had made it real with her own hands. "Supper is on the stove," she said. "It smells good," he said. "It is good," she said. She said it with the particular confidence of a woman who knows what she is doing and does not require agreement on that point. And Frederick smiled at her across the table in the lamplight and thought, not for the first time, that he had never met a person who was more purely and completely herself than Eva Bailey, and that being loved by such a person was the most specific and particular good fortune he could imagine. They ate supper. The children went to bed. The lamp burned low. The farm was quiet in the Texas night, and the stars were out in that astonishing August density. And on the south porch, in the chairs they had put there for exactly this purpose, Frederick and Eva Bailey sat together and listened to the night and said nothing for a long time, because nothing needed to be said, because everything was there in the warm air between them. In the house behind them and the land before them and the 15 years that had led from a woman leaning against a bank wall in the autumn light to this quiet porch at the end of a full day. "Do you remember the first time you saw me?" she said at last. "Outside the bank," he said. "October of '74. "What did you think?" "That you were gathering yourself," he said. "That you were not done." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was not," she said. "No," he said. "You were not." He put his arm around her. "And look what you built." "What we built," she said. "Yes," he said. "What we built." The night was warm and still, and somewhere in the dark a night bird called once and was answered, and the wheat on the far edge of the property whispered in some small movement of air, and the south porch held them both in its patient frame of wood and lamplight. And Eva Bailey, who had been the woman the whole county pitied, sat in the life she had made and found it very good.